to a couple of my colleagues, Eliot Rose and Joe Broach, with work with Portland Metro. And so we'll move from TNCs into emerging micromobility landscape of e-scooters and looking at modeling e-scooters at Metro. So Eliot, please take it away.
Thanks, Kyle. How much time would you like me to take for this presentation, just so I can monitor myself?
Well, I think you're getting a late nod here, so I think maybe just up until 11:45-ish or so, if we can keep it to a half hour.
All right, we'll move through it. I think we can do that. Thank you.
Okay, great.
All right. Thanks
Welcome.
everyone for having me. Thanks to Joe and Bibiana for presenting. This is really August company here, and I hope I can live up to the cool stuff that they shared. I want to share some information about a project that we did to really work with Peabot to bring some of the data that they have been collecting through their e-scooter program, e-scooter share program, into Metro's travel model. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so you can see the presentation here. Now we got and I have to acknowledge before we dive in, Peabot staff who aren't here today, including Jacob Sherman, Michael McDonald, Aubrey Lindstrom, played a really big role in this project, as did ODOT, which funded the grant that supported this. So thank you to everyone who's not here today. And I'm sorry Portland couldn't be here to join us. So the goal of our project was really to integrate data on shared micromobility trips, particularly e-scooter, into the other data sets that we use in regional transportation planning. I used to I'm a transportation planner, not a hardcore data person, though I like to dabble. And I ran Metro's program planning for e-scooters and other emerging modes like TNCs. And Metro being a data provider for the region, there's a natural kind of interest for Metro to look just not at planning for these services on the transportation network, but also using the data that they generate to inform transportation decisions in the way that we've all been talking about today on this call. So some of the big objectives we had to accomplish to successfully do this were sharing aggregate data while protecting users' privacy. You're going to hear me talk a lot about privacy today, and my impression with talking with modelers, forgive me if I'm wrong, is that privacy, I often get like kind of scratched heads when I talk about privacy issues in TNC and e-scooter data from the modeling side. And that makes sense because people who are modeling are working often with sampling and aggregating data and have a very detailed and nuanced understanding of the difference between disaggregate and aggregate data and the risks inherent in different types of uses of data. But for the rest of the world, for a lot of us planners, and particularly the regulators, it's been hard to figure out that privacy has been a big issue with respect to TNC and e-scooter data. There have been some really interesting studies, even pre-TNCs, that showed how publicly available taxi data could be used to identify the locations of celebrities' homes who use taxis in New York. There have been lawsuits between Uber as well as privacy advocates and cities over how this data is shared. And so it tends to be a big deal shaping things. And I think it's due to a mismatch of the end uses of the data, where a lot of the uses of e-scooter data tends to be disaggregate and focused on operating the system from moment to moment. Whereas when we do planning, we're looking at aggregate data and big picture insights about people's movements. And we seldom delve into the details that really pose privacy risks. But we also don't get to have a conversation about what's the value of the data and whether it's worth the privacy risk if we don't start investigating that data. And so my goal in this sector has really been able to try to find safe ways to explore the value of the data that's generated by these systems for planning purposes in a way that helps really advance the conversation around how we can use this data in transportation planning. On Portland's side, they do a lot of planning and evaluation for their shared e-scooter system. We wanted to support that. And then on Metro's side, Joe has done a great job standing up a bike network model for Metro. And we wanted to see if the insights that we got from the e-scooter data could help us better understand cyclist movements more generally as well. So fundamentally, the challenge here is that we're dealing with two different aggregation networks. And I'm going to pause for a little bit. Portland shares the data that they collect from their e-scooter system through a public dashboard as well. I'm going to post that in the chat real quick so that you can, check out what that looks like at some point if you're curious about how Portland views and serves up this data. But one of the challenges we were dealing with is that PBOT drew cells around the scooter data that were designed to preserve anonymity in the scooter data. So when they're aggregating trip ends, they aggregate to this network that's shown. It's really drawn to include to make sure that there are at least 3 scooter origins or destinations in any one of these scooter trip origins or destinations in any one of these zones, so that you're never showing data on an individual trip that could expose an individual's travel patterns. And also, they draw their cells pretty tightly around parks and street segments, because those are areas that might generate some scooter trips, but since they don't have destination, specific land use destinations or residences there, you might want to monitor those locations a little bit more closely. Also because scooters have some quirks in how they're regulated in parks in Portland. So meanwhile, on the right-hand side of this, I have Metro's zonal network. We have several different zonal networks that we use in travel modeling. This is the finest zone network we use. It's called our microanalysis zones. That should be a mu instead of an M on the MAZs, but I'm kind of lazy. This is derived from census geographies. It's drawn based around the population of the different cells. And also the borders go along streets rather than encompassing streets, which is relevant to scooter data because PBOT, as you can see on the left-hand side, draws its cells to include bigger streets so it can do route level mapping easily. There's a different view of these two networks. This is in a more suburban area where land uses are less dense and more spread out. This is downtown. Okay, so what we were really charged with doing with before we could use any of this data was we had to find a way to re-aggregate the data that Portland collects in a way that protects protects privacy and addresses those concerns I talked about earlier, and at the same time is providing useful insights for transportation planning. We looked at a bunch of different options here. I'm not going to go through everything on this side, but we considered different geographic scales, different months of the year, different days of the week in our aggregations, and that led us to aggregations that included a wide range of numbers of records, everything from 10 up to almost 400,000. The choices that we finally went with in our preferred aggregation for this data set are shown in bold. And basically what we realized as we were testing the utility of different aggregations is that, we need really fine scale data on where trips happen, because we're often looking at infrastructure decisions, and those decisions need to be made at a pretty fine scale when you're planning bike ped facilities, because those are short trips. But we don't need detailed data on when trips happen, because we're planning infrastructure by and large often with this data, and infrastructure, unfortunately, as much as we'd like sometimes, doesn't roll itself up and store itself in the winter. It's there year round. It's there all day. It's there every day of the week. So this may not be super interesting to you, but I put this in front. I'm keeping this slide in for some of my privacy colleagues if you want to see how they think about it. We looked at privacy risk in terms of whether we were able to identify recurrent trips between origins and destinations that didn't otherwise see many trips that might reveal some, and that's a case where it might reveal someone's unique travel patterns. I think the takeaway for us was that risk seemed very, very rare in this data set. And an actor would need to, even to identify someone in one of those rare cases, have some other information about that person to bring into the equation. They couldn't do it with the data in the trip data set alone. And so, in some circles, I have robust conversations about what the level of privacy risk is in the situation. Happy to have one with y'all if you're interested in going that way, but I'm going to keep moving through the presentation in interesting time. So first thing we did here was made a heat map. This is the first thing you do when anybody seems to do when they get any data on any of these shared systems, is show where the highest and lowest density of trips is and how that varies throughout the service area. I think at a high level, you can see where the heat is in the region. And there's a lot of heat around downtown and the inner southeast neighborhoods, which are real walkable and bikeable and have a lot of destinations. Are popular among tourists, which continues to be a big part of e-scooter ridership. But then you also have some heat out in East Portland, and that's because Portland has equity requirements for locating scooters down there. And we had some really interesting findings about those requirements. So we looked at what generates the heat as well. And Joe created just a basic explanatory model where he looked at the correlation between different determinants and the amount of scooter trips that a zone experienced. And here are the variables that he found were significant. You got more rides if you're closer to downtown, if you have more people overall, and if you have more jobs in what I would say are generally the fun stuff sectors located in your zone. But the thing that really jumped out to us about this table was the second row, East Portland Equity Focus Area. Like I said, that is an area that's drawn east of 205 in Portland, and includes part of the Cully neighborhood up here, up north near the airport. You can clearly see how it stands out on the map. And scooter companies are required to locate a certain percentage of their fleet in that area at the start of each day so that scooters are available for use, and also required to offer discounted pricing in those zones. And so that requirement is associated, for each TAS where that requirement's in place, or each zone where that trip's in place, each microanalysis zone, you get 300 more trips. And that adds up to a lot. I mean, really what this model means from a practical perspective is that if we were just looking at the other factors, not this equity factor, just land use and transportation infrastructure, East Portland would likely be getting very few rides, but it's getting a significant number of rides because it seems to be getting a significant number of rides because these equity requirements are in place. That said, cost, as I mentioned about TNCs in the chat, cost of scooter trips has been fluctuating a little bit. Companies offer discounts in East Portland, but they don't actually report the costs of trips in the specification that they use to report data to the city of Portland. It's an optional field, and they aren't filling it out, and that's fine, but it limits some of the insights we're able to get on equity from this data. Joe also looked at how far out of the way scooter users need to travel to take a safe route. And what this is really looking at is the extent to which someone has to go out of their way to use a route that's on high quality bicycle facilities versus to just take the most direct allowable bicycle route to their destination. And it's it's weighting that by the number of people who are taking trips in each zone. So what you're seeing is you have a high density of people who are going out of their way to take safe scooter trips in various places throughout the region, both in some pockets of downtown and the inner east side where usage is really high. And then you also see some areas kind of further out in East Portland along, along Powell Boulevard and up here in Cully, or along 205 right here, light up in terms of, and those indicate places where adding more infrastructure could potentially benefit a disproportionate amount of scooter users. Joe actually has two cool metrics of bicycle inconvenience that he works into the model. This lower one is the one I talked about first. How much longer is the most direct high quality route than the most direct bikeable route? There's also another measure he's worked out, this how much longer is just the most direct route you can bike on than the most direct drivable route. You know, it basically factors for the fact that you can't bike on throughways and other restricted access roads. And you know, when we break out the results for this, for the whole Portland service area versus East Portland, you know, that factor is a bigger impedance in East Portland. And then the lack of a high quality route is the bigger impedance in the rest of the city. And, you know, you see, so what that says to us is we got two different issues to completing the street network to support active transportation. In most of the region, it's about getting high quality bike facilities. But in East Portland, where the street grid's still not fully connected and doesn't offer a lot of direct routes for bicyclists, it may just be about providing basic street connections that make the grid more permeable. And so Joe used some of this work to actually, you know, model how many more scooter trips we might see if we built out the regional bike network in full. This is something that we dream about at Metro, building out the regional bike network in full. There's a lot of it yet to build. And this is kind of illustrative, right? Because if we did, we don't do that. This assumes we do build it out all at once. And of course, we'd always prioritize the most significant interventions and most significant facilities first. But this gives you a picture of where you'd expect to see more trips if you built out the network. And, you know, again, you see a different picture of where, you know, you potentially see more scooter ridership from providing safer facilities. That certainly happens in the core of the region, but there are also a lot of other places around the region that need it. So I think I covered all of these findings here. And before I just turn it over to y'all for the conversation, I want to make sure, Joe, do you have anything to add? Did I get anything wrong from your excellent work on this? Don't be afraid to correct me, please.
No, that was a great summary, Eliot. And yeah, like Eliot said, it's really nice to be able to focus on the sort of utility side of this sort of data. And I was excited to work on it because we all know we're all sitting on really exciting data like this, and sharing it even interagency with our partners and friends is sometimes maybe more difficult than we would like it to be. And we sometimes maybe get hung up on privacy or just don't have the resources to transfer the data, honestly. And it was neat to be able to work with the city of Portland and kind of show what we could do with this data if we shared more often. Thanks, Eliot. And yeah, happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you, Eliot and Joe. Let's see here. I know that the chat has been busy. I believe Joe answered Josh's question. Alex, let's see. So Alex would like to know, and I'd like to know as well, and I'm sure there are a few others. So thanks for asking, Alex. I'll direct this to you, Eliot, first, and Joe, feel free to chime in. Either one of you, I'm sure could answer this. But yeah, did the heat change with the modeling around what would happen if we had this illustrative bike ped network?
I'm actually going to punt that to Joe because I just know that Joe looked at this data in so much greater detail than he shared with me, as he does on this.
So maybe, yeah, I think I have a follow-up question. Maybe I'll just ask Alex to say, do you mean the distribution of the trips? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, right. Like, so the magnitude increased, but yeah, did it shift to what areas were using the network?
Yeah, it is a good question. We only really looked at the shift in terms of citywide and East Portland. And I think the modeling results, there were two scenarios we considered. there wasn't a big shift, no, in terms of the distribution of chips, at least. Like it didn't have a noticeably bigger impact, say, in East Portland than downtown. And part of that's what Eliot said. There's a quality of infrastructure problem more in the inner parts of Portland, where in the outer, it's almost more a quantity. You know, the block sizes are just large and connectivity is poor. And so adding facilities doesn't get you as far as quickly, maybe. So no, we didn't see a substantial shift in distribution. We didn't look at other areas, though, specifically that might have benefited, you know, disproportionately. And again, all this is caveated by this is very much a proof of concept. There's very little research to support, you know, whether scooter riders kind of follow the same preferences in terms of routes as bicyclists. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap, but there are also probably some differences in how they perceive the network. So this was just, you know, the idea here was what can we pull off the shelf to enrich this scooter data and hope that this seeds future research by us and others on just how to understand scooter riders and use and how they respond to infrastructure policy.
So Josh, thanks, Joe. Josh Roll from ODOT Research has asked a GHG question, and I think it's about building out that network, that larger network. Is there a crosswalk to translate some of those trips to GHG savings? It would be back of the envelope, but perhaps another compelling argument for building the system. Maybe it's more of a, and then he references maybe looking at VMT reductions at least, if not GHG. Do either one of you want to speak to that?
So yeah, I'd love to speak to that. As a consultant who used to do VMT and GHG reduction analysis a lot, I'm going to tell you, yes, Josh, there is a way. You know, and I think, you know, Portland's evaluation of e-scooters, which I'll drop in the chat when I get a breathing minute, does describe the percentage of trips that are displaced from drive alone and the average trip length. That said, I think if you were to do a thorough accounting, you may find a rather underwhelming number from this, because, you know, these are displacing short trips. The average scooter trip's a mile long. Also, this is something that Portland has been pretty aggressive in investigating, and I'm very curious to hear their results when they come out in the next system evaluation. But like, you know, the system is being rebalanced by car at night. And so there is some VMT associated with the rebalancing that's cutting into the reductions as well. So, you know, I mean, generally we can definitely do that, and you know, but generally, you know, I'm thinking back to our climate smart strategy, where we actually did this, not necessarily for shared scooters, but for bike ped strategies in general. You know, the greenhouse gas and VMT reductions are important, you know, but they tend to be pretty modest if you just look at bike ped trips, you know, and their benefits compared to other trips, because they're short trips. The bigger benefit is kind of, I think, bringing people into the multimodal transportation system. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long here, but I was interested in your comment about supply and demand. My personal assumption from the work that I've been doing is that it's more, the equity benefits have been more about supply than demand. And I say that because, you know, we've done a lot of direct work with community on these transportation options. And particularly for what we find for, you know, people with low incomes, is that the knowledge and the familiarity with these services is really the bigger barrier than the cost. Especially if you're logging on to Lime or whatever scooter operator for the first time. That's a big hurdle to get over. And so, you know, generally, like, I just kind of, what I hear about from folks and what I assume as I kind of watch these things kind of spread, these programs spread, is that having scooters be visible and having the supply out there helps people get over, has an outsized impact in helping people get over that initial hump of like, oh, this is for me. I should learn about this and enroll in this service and be ready to benefit from it. Once you do that, the rest is relatively easy.
I was curious, Eliot, about trip lengths. So thank you for bringing that up. Your comments also jogged my curiosity, I guess, about operators. About how many do we have in the Portland area right now? And are we gaining operators, losing operators? Where do we stand operator wise?
Great question, Kyle. And what a time to be alive it is. We have, I believe, 4 permitted operators, 3 of whom have continued their operations through the pandemic. Portland currently has an RFP open. We are moving from a permit to an RFP system for scooter use in the city of Portland. And what I've talked to with staff is the hope is to reduce the number of operators in the city through that RFP to 1 or 2, and through a went through and along with that having a contracting arrangement rather than a permitting arrangement allows you to engage in deeper, more flexible relationships with those operators. And I think PBOT's found that that's just the right place to be for a mode that's very much developing. I think the multi-operator, my impression is that the permitting model is really well suited for when you know exactly how you want to regulate a mode. And that you can think through all the risks and the regulations in advance. And we just haven't been in a state to do that with these emerging modes, and having more of a contract relationship where you can call someone up and talk about how to achieve your shared goals of your agreement together is just a better place to be, given how these modes are developing. And also, you know, it's new. It does generate a lot of questions and concerns and complaints from residents. And the fewer operators you have, the easier it is to coordinate on that. So I think, so it'll be interesting to see where we end up in the city of Portland and how that changes how things are operated. But we're moving to fewer, so the city's moving to fewer operators right now.
Now, I assume that I think you mentioned it earlier, all of the operators need to operate within the equity focus area. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct. I forget what the percentage is, but they need to locate a certain percentage of their fleets within the East Portland equity focus area by some time in the morning so that they're ready for use throughout the day.
Oh, so it's a daily target.
Yes.
Okay. Are there any operators that function exclusively in that area and don't serve other areas of the region?
No.
Okay.
No, and I think this is something really, I think it's a really important, something I pay attention to a lot as someone whose job is regional coordination. Portland is able, I think, to get the outcomes that they are in their equity focus areas because they have a market downtown and in the inner east side where all the operators want to be, and allowing the operators to be there creates an incentive that they can leverage to get operators to serve places that they wouldn't serve naturally.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
And, so
would it be too harsh to say subsidizing the equity areas? Is that too harsh of a word?
I mean, I'd have to think that through. But, off the top of my head, insofar as Portland and any city doing this work spends a significant amount of staff time managing the program. I think Portland's probably been, between 0.8 and 1.3 FTEs on this program, as long as I've been watching them. And, they do a lot of great work with that.
I just meant more from the, I guess
a
I meant,
disproportionate amount of that work goes to
Sure.
supporting scooters and equity focus areas.
sure. I maybe my question should have been more targeted around the actual market of user. Like, is there so much more usage downtown and they're getting so much more cost per rider downtown and inner southeast that it kind of makes up for the lack of cost per rider that they're required in these equity areas? I guess maybe that's a more targeted comment around that question.
Yeah, scooter, they have to be able to profit enough from the markets that are hot to be able to make the whole system work, accounting for the markets that are cool.
Okay.
And this is a lesson to me. And I think it's really interesting right now. I want to say that every time Portland has a permit or RFP open for scooters, operators start pitching other cities and other jurisdictions in the region, because they think it'll help, give them extra brownie points that, hey, of course you're going to let us into Portland. We're already in Tualatin, Beaverton, Tiger, Gresham, whatever other city they want to say they're in. So there's some opportunities for collaboration that often arise when a permit or RFP comes out. And, if y'all get one of those, if y'all are aware of people in your agency getting them, I think it's really important to be coordinating with Portland so that we're managing the whole system in the region to be able to collectively work out really well for our residents across the markets where scooters work naturally and those where they might need a little help, but where they might have an important equity benefit.
Cool. All right. Makes sense. Thank you so much, Eliot, and for joining our group.
Yeah, I want to just use my Milwaukee did allow Lime scooters at one point on a limited basis. Tualatin just to deal with Bird to let them in, and I'm not sure how that's showing up. And then there are also rides that go into Gresham that are interesting from an interjurisdictional standpoint.
Okay. Good stuff in micromobility happening.